August 27, 1945. The war is over. Though official surrender has yet to be signed, it is now simply a formality. The American destroyer, the USS Blue, is off the coast of the Japanese main island of Honshu when it is approached by a vessel. The crewmen aboard the USS Blue are astonished at the size of this Japanese submarine, the I-400, which rivals their ship in size. The captain of the I-400 offers his surrender, and this amazing piece of naval technology officially becomes a U.S. war prize. But little do the Americans know what amazing secrets it hides inside, and the terrible damage it was ready to inflict so close to home. While the war in Europe is one of battlefields and bombardments, the Pacific War is a very different conflict. With thousands of miles separating the two main combatants, much of this war is fought at sea, on islands, and in the skies above both. 5 months after Pearl Harbor was attacked, Jimmy Doolittle led a formation of 16 bombers on a mission launching from the USS Hornet in waters 650 nautical miles away from Japan, and led them to the Japanese home island of Honshu. There, 15 of the planes dropped 4 bombs each, 3 of which were high explosive munitions, and the 4th a bundle of incendiaries. The attack did little damage, but boosted American morale significantly. While Japanese officials downplayed the attack in their media, it proved that the heart of their empire was not invulnerable.
Well, it was around June of '42 when this plan came up. The original plan was to design and build 18 of these I-400 class submarines. And the idea was to take the war to the American homeland. You know, you had the Doolittle raiders, you know, raiding Tokyo in '42, which caused great consternation. So the Japanese thought, well, they came to our homeland and they bombed us. Well, we got to take the war to the American mainland. We want to build 18 of these huge submarines, and we're going to attack the vital installations, San Francisco, New York, New York City, Washington, D.C. You know, send our planes over there and bomb these the areas and scare the hell out of the Americans. You know, not only for for propaganda purposes too. You know, they couldn't hope to really do much, but the fact that the Doolittle raiders came over to Tokyo and caused devastation, you know, panic. You know, the Japanese wanted to do the same thing.
So Japanese submarine service in general was badly used. It was used for resupplying islands, picking up, pilots that may have for rescue services and that kind of stuff, but mostly like a supply cow. You know, it was very, very badly used. And so, like I say, this particular I-400, 401, and her sister ships were designed for a particular mission.
The concept of the Sen-Toku I-400 class submarine came from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese Imperial Navy. He proposed the idea in early 1942 in hopes of taking the war to the American homeland. The plan was to create 18 of these enormous submarines, which could make a round trip to the United States' west coast without refueling and carrying at least 2 attack aircraft. It was an ambitious proposal. In just 2 months, plans were drawn up. 5 would go into production, with the first of these, the I-400, being completed in December of 1944. The I-401 was finished just a few days later. The I-400 class were the largest submarines ever built, at 390 feet long, and would remain the largest until the 1960s. It had 4 2,250 horsepower engines that carried enough fuel to go around the world 1.5 times. The on-deck hangar would have enough room to store 3 aircraft, and the forward port side held a collapsible crane to hoist those aircraft back inside. The aircraft that the I-400 and its sister ships would carry were Aichi M6A Seirans, specially designed with folding wings. The 2-seaters would feature a V12 engine based off of a Daimler-Benz DB601 and feature detachable floats. They would carry 850 kilograms in either torpedoes or bombs and a 13mm machine gun. They would be launched via an air catapult on the forward deck. Mounting pressure on Japanese forces by the Allies would take a toll on the I-400 project. Only 4 of the planned 18 submarines would ever begin production.
The war situation got really bad, and so they only wound up completing 2 of them, 400 and 401.
The I-400, 401, and their complement of aircraft wouldn't strike at naval yards like at Pearl Harbor. They also wouldn't strike at the American homeland itself. Instead, they would strike a vital installation that would be both close to home for the U.S. and a good strategic target, the Panama Canal. The 77-kilometer-long canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans is key for the Americans to wage their war against Japan. Constructed over a 10-year period beginning in 1903, the canal falls within the bounds of the Panama Canal Zone, 553 square miles of U.S.-controlled territory. Its sophisticated lock system allowed ships to move from the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific via 2 lanes in a 20 to 30-hour transit, rather than having to traverse the 10,000-mile journey down past the southern tip of South America near Cape Horn. Due to the canal's strategic importance, it had been heavily guarded, with anti-torpedo nets and naval mines in nearby waters, anti-aircraft gun positions, long-range radar stations on each coast, gun batteries, aircraft warning stations, and 65,000 troops on the ground. But as the war went on and Japan's strength dwindled, the defense of the canal and its locks were no longer much of a priority. In January of 1944, an American POW who had guarded the canal was interviewed by Commander Yasuo Fujimori. The POW confirmed that the defenses had weakened and that air patrols were infrequent at best. With blueprints provided by a Japanese engineer who had worked on the creation of the canal, a team of shipping engineers studied the blueprints to determine where to strike. While the Pacific side would be the easier target, the Gatun locks on the Atlantic side would offer a chance to cause more damage that may take up to 6 months to repair. In June of 1945, a full-scale wooden model of the Gatun Locks Gate is constructed at Nanaowan, and over 15 days the submarine and air crews trained at launching the Seiran aircraft from the catapult and bombing the wooden gates. The I-400 and I-401, along with the smaller I-13 and I-14, carrying 2 Seiran aircraft each, would sail to the Gulf of Panama over the course of 2 months. When they were 100 nautical miles off the coast of Ecuador, all 10 Seirans would be deployed before daybreak, using the catapult launch mechanism on the front of the submarines. The 10 Seirans would fly across the northern coast of Colombia and turn around over the Caribbean Sea, where they would head toward Colon, Panama, where the Gatun locks of the Panama Canal are located. Once they launched their weapons at the gate, the pilots would rendezvous with the submarine again.
They would get very close, and the crane would actually hoist the airplane from the water and put it on the deck, and they would be disassembled and put back in the hangar. And no one would know where it came from, you know. The Americans would think, where in the hell did these planes come from? You know, we haven't detected any Japanese aircraft carriers, so they would be totally blindsided by this whole thing.
You got to understand that the Japanese pilots that were participating, they were participating basically in the second Pearl Harbor is what it was going to be. You know, the Panama Canal would have been the second Pearl Harbor. The world would have never imagined that this would have happened. Once again, the war in Europe's ended. The shipping is coming from Europe in the European campaign now through the Panama Canal, And now we've got to block that off is basically what their plan is and stuff, which is a great plan.
I thought the plan was brilliant because number one, it was audacious and it was daring, and technically it could be accomplished. They have been training for it. In 45, I mean, Japan was just holding on. You know, there was no chance at that time that they could have won the war. And yet they continued to be on the offensive, especially in terms of striking back. And it got to a point where a lot of these military leaders knew that the war was lost because they lost Saipan. But they continued to prosecute the war. They didn't want to lose face. They had to continue until they were told to stop.
It was this perspective that made the planners of the Panama Canal mission decide on a very desperate tactic, a sacrifice play involving their Seiran pilots on board the submarines.
Initially, they were supposed to attack the Panama Canal with torpedoes. But the plan was that when they were assembling the attack team, there weren't enough qualified, skilled torpedo bomber pilots. There just weren't any. They've all been killed, shot down, or whatever, but this is after Midway. And so they had a dilemma. To train a torpedo bomber pilot to a very professional level took years. And here they're going to attack the Panama Canal with torpedoes. Theoretically, it was possible, but it all hinged on the ability of the pilots to deliver that torpedo, and that was the stickler right there. They didn't have anyone trained enough to do that. So at the end, it was decided that they were going to have the pilots ram the locks with their aircraft to assure the destruction of the locks. And the pilots themselves, they didn't realize it was a kamikaze mission until they were well into the training program. And they weren't very happy when they found out, because kamikaze pilots weren't ordered. They were volunteers. But in this sense, in the I-400, they weren't told that it was a kamikaze mission. In fact, they weren't told at all. They had to learn it in an obtuse way. When they saw technicians removing the bomb racks from the airplanes and affixing bombs that could not be removed, they were just attached permanently. Then they got the suspicion, hey, what is this? You know, there's no bomb release mechanism. Then they figured out, oh, this is a kamikaze attack. So Ensign Takahashi, who was one of the pilots on the mission, stormed into his superior's office and raised hell. And that was a total breach of etiquette. He was an ensign screaming at the lieutenant, what the hell do you think this is? What do you think you're doing?
But for the moment, the pilots aboard the I-400 will not have to sacrifice themselves to attack Panama. With the fall of Okinawa in late June of 1945, the Japanese home islands were now entirely vulnerable to an Allied assault. The Japanese Naval General Staff ordered the I-400 and I-401 back towards home. They would be joining the smaller I-13 and I-14 on an attack against the 15 American aircraft carriers gathered at Ulithi Atoll. But would it still be a kamikaze mission?
The pilots were lined up at a ceremony before their departure, and Admiral Ozawa presented each of them with a ceremonial kamikaze dagger similar to this. and it was inscribed on the sheath, Admiral Ozawa and Special Attack Kamikaze. And when the pilots each received the dagger, they knew that it was a one-way mission. And so they had to accept their fate right then and there. They're not coming back. It's a one-way mission.
If demanding the sacrifice of their pilots wasn't enough, even further steps were being taken to ensure the success of the mission. Cunning and treacherous steps that might make an already questionable attack seem even more irredeemable.
The ships I-400 and 401 are ordered to the northern Japan base called Maiju. And what happens there at that base is the crew are actually given a 3-day liberty to go 3-day liberty. Meanwhile, the mechanics stay behind, and they're painting the aircraft from the green color on the Seiran with the red head of maru, which is the red, if you want to call it, meatball on the side of the aircraft, to silver, full silver aircraft with U.S. stars and bars.
For Ensign Takahashi, it's a step too far.
So he demanded to know who was behind this. And he was very, very angry because they were going on this kamikaze mission, and they're going to be flying in an aircraft disguised as American planes. And he had told me he thought it was very despicable. He says, we're Japanese, and we don't want to be flying an aircraft with American colors. That we're Japanese, we're going to die, we want to die in our aircraft painted in Japanese markings and not in American colors. He thought that was just really, really low down. And he confronted his superior officer about that, and they had a big argument. And he was told that they had to do this in order to ensure that they would be able to escape detection and hit their targets. And I also learned that the reasoning behind the false colors was that, well, heck, the Americans were indiscriminately bombing Japanese cities. They were committing war crimes. So because they're doing that, why should we, observe the international code? So that was the reasoning.
At that time, these aircraft would be launched without pontoons and would resemble P-51, the modern American P-51 at that time, and would possibly be mistaken for that if somebody were looking up at the aircraft at a glance and not knowing maybe what the engines sound like and that type of thing too. So basically what happens is they start heading towards Ulithi Atoll, and basically by this time we're getting closer to the end of the war now.
But news from home would send shockwaves through the crews of the 4 submarines just before their mission would be carried out.
On or about August 15th of 1945, the war ends. On the I-400 itself, our interviewee, Takahashi, was in the radio room, actually near the radio room here when the news came. And they heard, the radio men were listening to a broadcast from Hirohito, basically discussing that the war is now over. And the crew are basically shocked. Now you got to realize that the radio men are hearing this before Commander Kusaka's even hearing this, and the crew. They don't, Takahashi, other than being a pilot on board the submarine, he didn't really have any duty, so he could wander the ship and eat and do most anything, that of leisure, whatever there was to do, whether it was read or write letters or whatever, that type of thing. But now they're listening to this radio broadcast of Hirohito announcing that the war is now over. in disbelief. The crew they don't believe what they're hearing. And it was rebroadcast a few times and stuff like that. Now radio transmissions are coming for different units to surrender. And meanwhile, I-400 and I-401 are basically waiting for their next orders.
With their mission now canceled, the submarines go their separate ways. On the 22nd of August, 1945, the I-400 receives new orders. Orders that make the reality of the war situation really hit home. They are to scuttle the torpedoes, scuttle the aircraft, and head home to surrender.
For another few days in disbelief of what they're hearing now as far as scuttling their weaponry and this stuff, they floated around for yet another couple of days and wondering, are we actually hearing to believe what we hear, in this type of thing. Meanwhile, the crew on the submarine, half the crew wants to continue with some kind of mission. The other half of the crew wants to go home because they have wives and families and this kind of thing to return to. So clearly on both submarines, the 401 and 400, there was discussions of continuing some kind of mission. You often hear of this die-hard thing on the Japanese. Well, a lot of them are family people too. A lot of them want to go home and miss their families and that type of thing, and are lucky to be alive and want to return home. So now we're reaching August 26th now, and they've been given a specific order to raise a triangular flag, a triangular black flag, and to surrender their ships after they've scuttled their weaponry and stuff.
The I-400 and I-401, along with 22 other submarines, are transported by the U.S. Navy to Sasebo Bay in the south of Japan for further study. There, the Japanese naval crews train their American counterparts on how to operate the captured vessels. Vice Admiral Griffin, with a detachment of both Navy and Army officers, visits the Sasebo Bay dockyards to inspect the I-402, which had never been launched. The Japanese crew, along with their counterparts on the American prize crew, show the officers around this technological marvel, whose sister ships had come so close to wreaking havoc on America's Navy. It affords a unique opportunity to inspect this rare submarine, its inner workings, and the hold that would have stored the deadly aircraft. The advanced technology inside the hulls of these submarines would make for an excellent prize for any nation to study.
Now the Russians and the British would like one of these trophies. Now, so far the U.S. have been the only ones able to examine these ships here, these massive ships, and take all the data and stuff like that, and the U.S. as usual is not sharing real well. So the British and the Russians request through their channels that they want one of these provided to them. And basically the answer is no.
While 20 of the submarines are packed with explosives and sunk west of Nagasaki, the I-400, I-401, and 2 smaller submarines are sailed to Hawaii, where they are inspected more. But rather than keeping these incredible vessels and using them, commands are given to make sure these advanced submarines do not fall into anyone else's hands.
Once again, from continuous pressure of these foreign governments wanting these Japanese trophies now, 4 trophies, the decision is made we've done our research on them now we're going to scuttle them. So it starts off in a progression of some other Japanese submarines that were captured at another time, in the I-200, I-201. And these 2 submarines are taken out on or about March or April and shot through aft torpedo tubes of U.S. Gatto-class submarines and sunk off of Barber's Point in Oahu, off the Hawaiian Islands. They picked the location off Barber's Point because of the depth of the waters there, and that these submarines, once sunk, would be hard to recover. By May of 1946, I-401 meets her fate off of Barber's Point. And then lastly, by June of 1946, I-400 meets her fate and is torpedoed by the trumpet fish by aft torpedoes into her. Matter of fact, Captain McDowell was asked in June of 1946 when they scuttled I-400 whether he wanted to be aboard the trumpet fish when she met her fate. And he was very upset. And granted, he went to his high command saying, this is a tragedy. Number one, it's a tragedy that here we went through all this trouble to capture him. Here it has special technology, and it's a tragedy that we don't keep at least one of these for the Navy to be able to create their own. And what's interesting, even today, it's literally, just from my perspective, it's genius. It's genius that these things were created so in secret, and so many times when people hear about I-400 and their mission and stuff, nobody's ever heard of it. It's incredible. And even that nothing post World War II was ever created.
For almost 20 years, the I-400 class submarines remained the largest in the world. They were the last submarine aircraft carriers to be constructed. In 2005, a team of divers came across the wreck of the I-401 off the coast of Oahu. It was only in 2013 that the I-400 would be found by the same team of divers. The wrecks of these incredible vessels may lie at the bottom of the ocean. But at last, after so many years, the story of their mission has finally resurfaced.
From the newly won islands of the Marianas, a new kind of thunder rolls across the Pacific. These are the super fortresses, the B-29s. Watch them, silver giants rising from the runways, bound for the very heart of the enemy. High in the stratosphere, our boys are now delivering a message of fire and steel, directly to Tokyo's war machine. But the long road to Tokyo is also paved on the decks of our great carriers, the floating fortresses of the fleet. From these steel islands rise our naval wings, the champions of the sky, sweeping the enemy from the air. They are the hunters, protecting our fleet, engaging in furious combat high above the blue Pacific, clearing the way for the inevitable advance. Now, in these final desperate days, the enemy has unleashed a fanatical new weapon, the Kamikaze, a desperate suicidal lunge against our fleet. They come in low, they come in fast, with only one target in mind, our ships. But they are met with a wall of American steel. Look at that screen of fire. Our gunners, men from every state back home, stand by their guns. From the heavy 5-inch batteries to the rapid-fire cannons that line every rail, they throw up a curtain of flak so thick it seems no man could possibly fly through it. We are using every tool at our disposal, making every shell count in this terrible, necessary business. Our boys will not falter. They will hold the line. From the high-altitude raids of our super fortresses to the furious battles at sea, every arm of our mighty force is working as one. The enemy is surrounded. His navy is at the bottom of the sea. His air force is shattered. There can be, and will be, only one end to this: total victory. The road is hard. The cost is high. But we will finish this job. For every ship the enemy sinks, our shipyards back home have already launched 10 more. For every plane he sends on a one-way mission, our factories are rolling out 100 new fighters, 1,000 new bombers. The industrial might of a free world is a torrent that he cannot stop. He cannot even slow. Our fleets now sail where they please. Our air forces command the skies, sweeping away the last remnants of his power. The islands we've taken, hard fought and paid for in American courage, are now the unsinkable airfields, pointing like a dagger at his homeland. There is only the unconditional surrender of a defeated foe.
Now we know where we're going.
Did you get that about those snakes?
How did the skipper say it? Okie.
I heard him. He said Okinawa.
You know, they say this place looks like the country around Frisco.
They don't like it up in San Francisco when you call it Frisco. Spent my honeymoon up there. Drove up from L.A. Made it in 8 hours. 400 miles.
8 hours? What was holding you back? I used to make it from Buffalo to New York in 6 flat. That's 370 miles with hills.
370 miles. Why, right here we're closer to Japan than that. We're just 325 miles from their home office.
225 miles. You heard him. That's what the old man said.
325 miles. Boy, that's closer than Milwaukee to St. Louis. I always felt pretty safe in St. Louis.
It's awfully close. Mighty close.
Yes, mighty close. Especially for a modern bomber with a job to do. But here we were, closer than any fleet in history to a major land-based air power. At Midway, in the Coral Sea, even in the Marianas, distance had been against the Japanese Air Force. But now, as our fleet sailed against the enemy inner islands, the range was easy for any plane that could fly. There were those who said no fleet could risk it, but the stakes were high. With Okinawa in our hands, we could control the China coast, send swarms of planes to smother Japan. We were reaching for the throat of an empire. The risk must be taken. On the island of Okinawa, 5,000 miles from San Francisco, the earth shook from a fearful pounding by our ships and planes. To the south, our British allies were hurling their naval might at the bypassed fortress of Formosa. They were raking Sakashima with shell and bomb. England's greatest battleships and newest carriers were there, screening us on the south, paying off with pleasure an old debt to Nippon. On the northern flank, Admiral Mark A. Mitcher's tireless Task Force 58 stepped up its 2-week-old aerial assault on Kyushu and the enemy home islands. It was the 4th of July in reverse, on Japanese shipping, harbors, airfields, factories. Men of the Navy, 400,000 men, called it Love Day. Elsewhere in the world, it was Easter Sunday, 1945. At 8:30 that morning, the Marines and the Army went in. "100,000 Yanks were rattling the lock on Japan's front door. They were plowing sacred soil with American boots, tractors, tanks. The first 7 days were baffling, mysteriously quiet. Ashore, Army and Marines pushed steadily forward, looking for an enemy which had vanished. On the 1,400 ships supporting the invasion, men waited at their battle stations and waited. We knew the blow would come, but how and when? Then it struck. They call it Kamikaze, meaning the divine tempest. We call them suicide planes, manned by pilots wearing the ceremonial red sash of the Kamikaze Corps. They specialize in one-way trips. Their destination, the deck or hull of any American ship onto which plane, bombs, burning gasoline, and red-sashed pilot can crash. Japan's secret weapon was no secret to our gunners or our flyers, who for months had been tinting the far Pacific with those same red sashes. But now, to meet our latest challenge, our deepest thrust, there rose every plane that could fly, new or old, from the very heart of Japan itself. "16-year-olds, still in aviation schools, were given their wings, a sash, and a mission. It was a maniacal, all-out effort to smash our sea power, isolate our troops on Okinawa. It was desperation. It was suicide. But it would be the pattern from now on to the very finish. A struggle between men who want to die and men who fight to live. He's hit, but he's still heading for the target. Missed. By night it went on. Hundreds of land-based planes streaked low over the sea at our carrier. they dove out of the dawn, raced through dull overcast to throw themselves in screaming, smoking fury at Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's ships off Okinawa. Again, the old battleships were there, and new ships of the line. And a rugged little man named Ernie Pyle. There was no retreat. This was the fleet that came to stay, that had to stay. Had to stay because the men that the Navy landed needed tons of steel from Navy guns. Even as we beat off fresh waves of planes overhead, the big guns of the fleet smashed enemy strongholds miles away. Had to stay because our men advancing through the rice paddies and over the steep ridges had to have close air support from the baby flat top. In the air control room aboard the command ship, strike upon strike was ordered. Then the Navy and Marine flyers laid down precise, deadly rocket fire to help make the next 50 yards of advance less costly. This was the fleet that had to stay because always the stream of supplies to those troops must be steady and few. A bridge of ships was thrown across the Pacific to bring our men more food, more medicine, more ammunition. And waiting at the end of the longest supply route in any war were the Kamikaze. It was weird. It was savage. This was a fleet fighting like infantry, punching away at the enemy. Only there are no foxholes in the ocean.
March 18th to the 21st, 556 Japanese planes destroyed.
Men fought without sleep. Some fought with guns. Some with axes, torches. Some with fire-smothering foam. It was fix and fight at the same time. Don't Give Up the Ship became more than a schoolbook legend. It became a fact of life. April 13th brought more planes and shocking news. Between attacks, weary men, afloat and ashore, paid honor to the beloved figure in the blue Navy cloak, said farewell to the father of the modern American Navy. Then they turned and met the next assault. During 3 fabulous months, thousands of aircraft were hurled against our ships. But only 10% ever slipped through our air patrol. Yet the siege by air went on. The Japanese beast still spat zeros.
April 6th, 277 enemy planes shot down. April 12th, 100 planes. May 3rd, 97.
In the early gray hours of the morning watch on May 9th, the great news came. VE Day in Europe. It came first to the lookouts, to the men who stand guard while the others sleep. Men were glad and grateful. Home seemed a little nearer. But for now, VE Day was simply the 1,247th day of our Pacific War. From the rolling decks of our carriers, the fighters rose once again to intercept the enemy. On the cruisers and destroyers and battleships, our heavy batteries once more leveled against studded hills of Okinawa. The barking 20s and 40s sent streams of fiery lead into the world's last alien sky. For week after vicious week, the most devastating air-sea battle of all time wore on. The Japanese paid with their air force, with their newest ships, 4,232 planes. The fleet that came to stay paid a price too. But our men, our ships, our planes, took everything the land could throw at the sea and handed it back double. The question, could a fleet stand up against the massed fury of land-based planes, got an emphatic answer from the men who fight to live, from the fleet that came to stay.
In June of 1942, a pivotal naval confrontation unfolded, marking one of the most significant battles of World War II as the United States of America faced off against the Japanese Empire. Fought exclusively with aircraft carriers positioned hundreds of miles apart, the Battle of Midway represented a groundbreaking naval conflict. It marked the inaugural major fleet engagement where opposing fleets never closed the gap to visually spot each other's ships. Victory or defeat depended not on the big guns of battleships, but on the carrier-borne bombers and torpedo bombers flying over vast tracts of ocean to seek and destroy their targets. Midway was the dawn of a new era in naval warfare. The Battle of Midway held paramount significance for Japan, as it was envisioned as the pivotal element in a grand strategy aimed at expanding the empire's territorial reach deep into the Pacific. Midway Island, a crucial American stronghold, was slated for assault and occupation, while the United States Pacific Fleet, en route to defend it with its scarce aircraft carriers, would fall into an ambush, leading to its annihilation. Should the remaining vestiges of American naval might be ultimately shattered, Japanese dominance over the Pacific would remain unassailable for the foreseeable future. In fact, in the Battle of Midway, the Japanese carrier fleet, the mightiest in existence, was utterly destroyed, and Japan suffered her greatest defeat for over 300 years. During the Battle of Midway, Japan, at the zenith of its military strength, suffered not only a significant naval defeat, but also, in the span of a single day, sealed the fate of the Japanese Empire, leading it toward downfall and defeat. Since the early 1930s, Japanese conquests in China had caused ever-increasing friction with the United States. Starting in mid-1940, the United States imposed a prohibition on the export of arms, scrap iron, and other critical strategic resources to the Japanese Empire. Then, in July 1941, America led an international oil embargo and froze all Japanese overseas assets. The effect was devastating. Up to now, 90% of Japan's oil had been imported, and her stockpiles were rapidly dwindling. As time grew scarce, the Japanese leadership made a momentous choice to embark on invasions and conquests of neighboring regions abundant in oil and other essential raw materials. First, a major obstacle would have to be eliminated: the American Pacific Fleet, anchored at Hawaii. In the early hours just prior to dawn on December 7, 1941, a fleet of 360 bombers and fighters took off from Japanese aircraft carriers positioned 230 miles north of Hawaii. Their target was the 3 carriers and the 8 battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet, based in Pearl Harbor. In the span of just 2 hours, a total of 18 American warships, including 6 battleships, were sent to the depths, while an additional 90 vessels sustained damage from bombs or torpedoes. Almost 200 planes were destroyed on the ground, and over 3,500 U.S. personnel killed or wounded. The Japanese lost only 29 aircraft. It was a stunning victory. Shortly after noon the next day, the United States declared war on the Japanese Empire. Following the devastation of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the path was cleared for the Japanese campaign of expansion and conquest. In advance of the impending onslaught, garrisons across the region had covertly bolstered their defenses, and thousands of troops had been assembled and readied for action. In the hours following the Pearl Harbor raid, Japanese aircraft launched attacks on American air bases located at Wake Island, Guam, and Luzon in the Philippines. With complete air superiority, the Japanese launched their invasions. Forces in French Indochina, already held by the Japanese, rapidly advanced into Thailand and Burma. Troops from the island of Hainan landed in Malaya. On that very day, an initial raiding force commenced the invasion of the Philippines, swiftly followed by larger-scale landings. Over the next 3 weeks, Wake Island and Hong Kong fell to the Japanese. Borneo and Caleb were invaded and Sumatra was occupied. On February the 19th, Japanese aircraft carriers launched a lightning raid on Port Darwin in northern Australia, sinking 12 merchant ships and eliminating Darwin as a valuable Allied base. Early March saw the climax of the Japanese expansion, the inevitable occupation of Java. In a little over 3 months, Japan had conquered 1/4 of the Pacific Ocean. By securing a stable oil supply and expanding the defensive perimeter around their homeland, Japan had successfully accomplished all of its immediate wartime objectives. Yet in spite of the breathtaking scale of the Japanese victories, there did remain one major threat to the security of her Pacific conquests. 3 aircraft carriers from the United States Pacific Fleet managed to elude the devastation at Pearl Harbor, and within a matter of weeks, each of them served as a central core for a newly formed task force. After minor raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, 2 of the American carriers set sail on one of the most audacious missions of the Pacific War, to bomb Tokyo, the heart of the Japanese Empire. In early April 1942, the aircraft carrier Hornet embarked on a westward journey from the U.S. naval base in Alameda, California, to meet up with its sister ship, the Enterprise, which was sailing from Pearl Harbor. With adept maneuvering to bypass the protective string of Japanese-controlled islands, both the Hornet and the Enterprise managed to penetrate to a point within 825 miles of Japan's coastline. At 8:24 on the 18th of April, 16 Mitchells took off from the Hornet and struck a course for the Japanese capital. Flying low, they avoided Japan's fighter defenses, and 15 aircraft dropped their bombs on the city. All but one of the Mitchells escaped to safety in mainland China or Russia. Following the attack, famously referred to as the Doolittle Raid, which took its name from its commander, Japanese military leaders were deeply alarmed and concerned. Even though the raid had inflicted only minor physical damage, it delivered a significant blow to Japan's sense of national pride. The need to protect the emperor was at the very core of the armed forces' being, and an agony of shame swept through the high command. Japan's leaders swiftly arrived at the conclusion that there was just one means by which they could ensure the adequate protection of homeland and the emperor. The frontiers of the empire must be pushed even further into the Pacific. In October 1941, General Hideki Tojo had been appointed Prime Minister of Imperial Japan. In his role as the Army Chief of Staff, Tojo harbored a profound ambition to witness the successful culmination of the Japanese campaign in China. He firmly believed that the sole path to achieving this goal was to secure a decisive victory over the Western powers. On his appointment as Prime Minister, General Tojo had kept his post as Chief of Staff and the job of War Minister. However, although an immensely powerful figure, Tojo did not have the complete control of government policy. Within a cabinet comprising representatives from all branches of the armed forces, he could rely primarily on the backing of the army. Consequently, most decisions ultimately resulted from a compromise between the army and the navy. Even prior to the Doolittle raid, expanding the empire's boundaries into the Pacific had been a cherished aspiration of a powerful naval faction. After the raid, arguments between the army and navy evaporated. Because the proposed operation would demand little army participation, Tojo finally gave his support. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been elected President of the United States in 1932. Strongly against the prevailing sentiment of isolationism, Roosevelt had the conviction that America should actively engage on the global stage. Even before the outbreak of war in Europe, Roosevelt had warned of the dangers posed by Nazi Germany's ambitions. Following the German conquest of the continent in 1940, Roosevelt, despite facing domestic opposition, progressively bolstered his support for Britain in its battle for survival. It was also Roosevelt who, in relation for Japanese actions against China, had imposed the oil and trade embargo on Japan. As a former Assistant Secretary to the Navy and now its Commander-in-Chief, Roosevelt took a special interest in the service. He handpicked his own flag officers and staff members, driven by his unwavering belief that the Navy should be led by the most qualified individuals for the roles. In a testament to his commitment to competence, he appointed Frank Knox, a member of the opposition Republican Party, to head the Navy Department. Under Roosevelt and Knox, the naval budget steadily rose. Even following the events at Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt maintained a belief that ran contrary to the desires of the American public. He believed that a war in Europe should take precedence over actions in the Pacific. He understood that enormous resources would be needed to push back the tide of the Japanese conquest, and until the full might of American industry could be brought to bear, the United States would have to concentrate on holding the line. Roosevelt insisted that further Japanese expansion must be counted at all costs. The Imperial High Command anticipated that the expansion of the Japanese defense perimeter in the Pacific, while presenting logistical complexities, would pose minimal substantive challenges. On the islands to be invaded, enemy forces were weak, and at sea, it seemed there was little to fear from the Americans or the British. The Japanese Navy, the diving force behind the plan, was supremely confident. The first stage of the Japanese plan of conquest was to complete the occupation of New Guinea. As of April 1942, a portion of New Guinea had already fallen under Japanese control, and they were eager to prevent the Allies from gaining control over the entire island. An advanced striking force of troop transports and heavy cruisers would be assembled in Rabaul along with the 3 aircraft carriers of Truk. The forces from Rabaul would sail south, then split into 2 divisions. The first was to seize Lagi and the Solomon Islands. The second, supported by 1 aircraft carrier from Truk, was to capture Port Moresby. The remaining 2 carriers would enter the Coral Sea and engage any enemy found there. Once New Guinea had been occupied, then New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would easily be captured. In order to expand the Japanese front in the northern region, 3 islands within the Aleutian chain, Attu, Kiska, and Adak, were slated for conquest. The next stage in the Japanese advance would be the occupation of the American-held island of Midway, 1,136 miles west of Hawaii. Seizing Midway would secure an airstrip for the Empire within a range that could threaten the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Although the capture of Midway would provide a vital stepping stone in any future action against Hawaii, the operation would also have another equally important objective. It would be used to lure American aircraft carriers out of Pearl Harbor and force them to fight a battle that would end in their destruction. The strategy for capturing Midway and defending the American carrier fleet was a multifaceted and intricate amalgamation of invasion, diversion, reaction, and ambush tactics. The first step in the Midway offensive would be the dispatch of a Japanese submarine fleet to set up to reconnaissance cordons, one 500 miles west of Pearl Harbor and the other between Hawaii and Midway. As the submarines assumed their designated positions, a Midway occupation force, comprising troop ships accompanied by a division of heavy cruisers, would depart from the Marianas and proceed northeast towards Midway. In order to incapacitate Midway's defenses and stage an ambush against the American carrier fleet, a formidable carrier strike force was organized, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers backed by battleships, heavy cruisers, and a robust destroyer screen. The carriers and their support would sortie east through the Bungo Channel. They would be followed by a main force of 6 battleships. In the northern region, a second task force comprising carriers and transports, escorted by cruisers, destroyers, and battleships, would launch an attack on the Aleutian Islands. The Aleutians operation had a secondary purpose. It would divert the Americans from the impending attack on Midway, tempting them to send the carrier north. In order to intercept any U.S. warships dispatched from Pearl Harbor, the Japanese fleet would be strategically repositioned to lay in wait. To the south, the Japanese carrier strike force would approach within 250 miles of Midway and attack the airfield, hangars, and shoreline installations. The invasion would quickly follow. As the Midway landings were in progress, the carrier strike force and the main force battleships redeployed 500 miles from the island would lie in wait. Upon the departure of the American fleet from Pearl Harbor and their detection by the submarine surveillance perimeter around Hawaii, or the long-range reconnaissance patrols originating from the Marshall Islands, the Japanese carriers would move into engagement. The big guns of the main force battleships would then finish the remnants of American sea power in the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Navy code JN-25 had been partially broken by U.S. naval intelligence. However, the cipher was complex, and many messages still remained difficult to understand. Commander Joseph Rochefort was head of the Naval Communications Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor. It was Rochefort who finally succeeded in adding a piece of the cipher jigsaw, vital to the Midway operation. By early May, Rochefort had a strong suspicion that a major attack was being planned for Midway based on partially deciphered Japanese messages. However, obtaining confirmation was challenging, and alternative interpretations remained plausible. The code that the Japanese used to represent the island was unknown, but was supposed to be the letters AF. Rochefort designed a simple ruse, which was given the go-ahead by his superiors, prompting Rochefort to coordinate an urgent request from the island for a freshwater tanker. 2 days later, on the 12th of May, an American listening post picked up a Japanese radio message AF is short of water. It was clear that the coded messages referring to an attack on AF meant that Midway was the true objective of Japan's coming operation. Already, the Japanese plan was fatally compromised. While the Americans would face a significant numerical disadvantage in the impending battle, the efforts of the code breakers at Pearl Harbor allowed them to make a more precise estimation of the likely date of the attack, narrowing it down to a range between June 4th and June 8th. Knowing that the Japanese invasion of the Aleutians was merely a feint, the Pacific Fleet could afford to concentrate its strongest naval force in the Midway area. Moreover, being aware that Japanese aircraft carriers would be positioned in ambush, the Americans could disregard the invading forces and concentrate their efforts entirely on targeting the enemy carriers. The United States had a precise asset in the island of Midway itself. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and even B-17s could be stationed there to attack the Japanese fleet. As an unsinkable airbase, the island held immense value as a contingency landing strip for carrier-based aircraft that might be damaged or running low on fuel. In addition, Midway had 2 old but powerful radars, which could be used to help detect and track Japanese attacks. The United States naval strategy to counter the Japanese operation at Midway was meticulously crafted to leverage every advantage held by the Americans. The American defense of Midway would hinge on the ability of 2 carrier task forces to find and destroy the Japanese fleet. Task Force 16, based around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, would be the first to sail from Pearl Harbor. Task Force 17, with the carrier Yorktown, would follow 2 days later. All 3 carriers would rendezvous at Point Luck, 325 miles northeast of Midway. As the Japanese carrier strike force approached the area, the problem of the Americans would be finding it. The radar systems on American carriers had a limited range of 150 miles. If the carrier's own reconnaissance patrols couldn't establish contact, the fleet would need to depend on long-range aircraft stationed on Midway Island. Midway's reconnaissance Catalinas would fly 700 miles out to sea in search of the Japanese. In the event that the enemy fleet was detected, the Catalina aircraft would shadow it until it entered the range of the Midway radar station. Midway radar would then keep the pursuing American carriers fully informed. An all-out attack of land and carrier-based aircraft could then be accurately vectored in to destroy the Japanese strike force. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the strategy to defeat the United States Navy at Midway, assumed the role of Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet in 1939. A dynamic and powerful personality, Yamamoto had little regard for the abilities of his superiors, and he was well aware that they were intimidated by his standing and his track record. Yamamoto's remarkable achievements as the orchestrator of the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent Pacific triumphs granted him significant latitude in formulating and executing offensive strategies. Yamamoto's resolve to have his strategies adopted was so unwavering that he often resorted to threatening resignation if his plans were not embraced. In his youth, Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University and, as a graduate, had served in Washington as naval attaché. Knowing the United States intimately, Yamamoto greatly feared America's industrial might. Prior to the events at Pearl Harbor, he had made efforts to persuade his superiors about the potential risks Japan would confront in a protracted conflict with the United States. However, once he realized that Japan was committed to war, Yamamoto was determined to win it, his way. The destruction of the American fleet at Midway would buy Japan much-needed time. Yamamoto's aspirations centered on the concept of the Kasen Kantai, the pivotal and conclusive battle that would compel the Americans to engage in peace negotiations. He understood that a fleet engagement was a reckless gamble, but as an inveterate poker and shogi player, He was convinced that the only possibility of a victory lay in staking everything on just one card. Admiral Chester Nimitz, a gifted strategist and organizer, had been appointed Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet on the 31st of December 1941, immediately after the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor. Nimitz held the belief that the tragedy at Pearl Harbor was not attributable to incompetence, and his subsequent policy of keeping all officers in their positions significantly boosted morale within the American Pacific Fleet. Nimitz's personable style of management plus a remarkable gift for trusting subordinates to do their jobs without interference would prove crucial in the battle ahead. Following the Pearl Harbor attack, it was Chester Nimitz who recognized that the era of the formidable battleship armed with big guns was coming to an end. He understood that the future striking power of America's Navy would be centered around the aircraft carrier. While under Nimitz's direction, America's carrier building system was accelerated, for the moment, he would have to make do with what he had, just 4 aircraft carriers and their support ships. In spite of his slender resources, Nimitz would stick to the tactical doctrine he had always advocated. For aircraft carriers, attack is the best form of defense. To the Japanese Navy, the outcome of the forthcoming battle was never in doubt. So far, the war had yielded an unbroken string of successes, and the certainty of victory was shared by all ranks. The confidence was so high that some flag officers harbored a genuine concern that the Americans might be hesitant to engage in combat and choose to remain within the secure confines of Pearl Harbor. One advanced seaplane squadron even sent a signal to its headquarters, requesting that all future mail should be directed to Midway. The results of war games simulating the coming battle were also ignored. When a scenario of this nature led to the involvement of American bombers from Midway Island and the subsequent destruction of 2 Japanese carriers, the final outcome was deemed unacceptable and was overridden by the Imperial authorities. For the massive undertaking that would expand the Japanese Empire and destroy the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, Japan could muster almost its entire combined fleet. All 9 of the fleet's battleships, along with 11 carriers, could take part in the coming operations. Of these, 4 carriers eventually participate in the Battle of Midway. Akagi, or Red Castle, was laid down as a battlecruiser in 1920. 2 years later, she was converted into an aircraft carrier. In 1934, Akagi was extensively modified to accommodate 30 more aircraft, taking her battle complement to 91. Akagi was only one of 2 carriers ever built, with the bridge on the port side. Kaga, or Increased Joy, was originally laid down as a battleship, but in 1924, work began to convert her into a carrier. She was completed in March 1928. Later, Kaga's triple deck was replaced by a much lengthened single deck and a major refit. Her aircraft capacity was raised from 60 to 90. Soryu, the Green Dragon, was launched in December 1935. Built under the limitations of the Washington Naval Treaty, Soryu was small and cramped. Nevertheless, she could still carry 63 aircraft. And the design was so successful, she was the model for the nearly all later Japanese carriers. Hiryu, the Flying Dragon, like Akagi, had her bridge on the port side. Because of the universal tendency of pilots to veer to the left in emergency, the design caused many more landing accidents. Hiryu was, however, very much more seaworthy than her predecessors. Her complement of aircraft was 63. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter was the most potent and visible symbol of Japanese prowess in the Pacific War. Purpose-designed as a Navy fighter to operate from land bases and aircraft carriers, the Zero would acquire an awesome reputation. The Zero had a remarkably clean airframe and was very light in weight. The result was high speed and excellent fuel economy. However, these advantages were achieved at the expense of pilot protection. The Zero had no armor and no self-sealing fuel tanks. More Zeros would be built than any other Japanese aircraft. The Aichi D3A Val 2-seater was the first all-metal monoplane dive bomber to enter Japanese naval service. In the hands of experts, the Val was a formidable weapon, realizing an 80% strike accuracy during the early Japanese conquests. The aircraft was constructed with such robustness and maneuverability that even with a fixed undercarriage, it could transform into a highly proficient fighter once it had released its bombs. Although the Nakajima B-5N Kate was slow and poorly protected, it was at the time of Midway the best aircraft of its type in the world. On its introduction in 1937, it had boasted many advanced features such as folding wings, a retractable undercarriage, and integral wing fuel tanks. Effective as a conventional bomber, as a torpedo bomber, the Kate was devastating. The aircraft was armed with the excellent Type 91 torpedo. The Type 91 could be released at a speed of 200 miles an hour and from an altitude of up to 300 meters, providing valuable protection against anti-aircraft fire. The naval pilots preparing for New Guinea and Midway operations were seasoned veterans of the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had gone to fly on combat missions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. For Japanese pilots, the intervals between combat operations were entirely taken up by training. The motto was, train hard, fight easy. Japanese determination to achieve the highest standards in Navy flying had not come without a price. Pilot training was lengthy and expensive. Only 100 naval pilots graduated annually from the training schools, which proved insufficient to meet the continuous demands imposed on Japanese carrier forces since the war began. There had been no leave for Navy aircrew. The training of Japanese sailors and flight deck personnel was, if anything, even more arduous than that undergone by their pilot comrades. These men were conscripts, toughened by rigorous discipline and relentless battle training that ensured that a ship could be swiftly prepared for action stations, and a full strike force could be launched within 5 minutes. During the heat of battle, a flight could be rearmed, refueled, and airborne again within 1 hour. Although the combat readiness of Japanese sailors and airmen was unsurpassed, there was an underlying weakness in the Navy's preparation for the coming operations. Before Pearl Harbor, aircrew had been able to practice 4 bomb runs a day, and dive bombers had been expected to score 80% hit rates or better. There had also been extensive fleet maneuvers. Now, amidst the exacerbated fuel shortages that ignited the war, maneuvers and bombing practice faced even stricter limitations. At Midway, the consequences for the Imperial Navy would be nothing short of catastrophic. Soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it had become clear to senior American naval commanders that although the damage done was severe, it was far from the fatal blow the Japanese had intended. The Pacific Fleet's priceless aircraft carriers had escaped. The Japanese had been unsuccessful in their attempts to obliterate the ship repair yards, and they had overlooked the fuel depots at the bases, leaving substantial oil reserves untouched. In spite of Japanese efforts, Pearl Harbor still played host to a powerful American naval presence. Hawaii was the base for the United States' 3 Pacific Fleet carriers, plus 1/4 transferred from the Atlantic Fleet. Each carrier was supported by its screen of up to 2 heavy cruisers and 5 destroyers. Nearly 20 submarines protected the waters around Oahu and Midway Island. Due to Admiral Nimitz's conviction that the Japanese Navy's overwhelming superiority made it one-hit-run tactics feasible, the sluggish Pacific Fleet battleships were excluded from any role in the forthcoming operation. Those that had been repaired after the Pearl Harbor attack were sent to San Francisco to patrol the west coast of the United States. Everything would now depend on the speed and long-range hitting power of the American carriers. All 3 of the carriers that would take part in the Battle of Midway were the Yorktown class. Commissioned by October 1941, the ships were Yorktown, Hornet, and Enterprise. Although slightly slower than its Japanese equivalent, the Yorktown class was capable of carrying an extra 20 aircraft. Yorktown carriers were notable for their advanced damage control systems. In order to reduce the risk of firing during an impending enemy attack, aviation gas fuel lines could be filled with carbon dioxide. The carrier's decks were also specially designed for combat conditions. The flight deck was unarmored and constructed with 6-inch planks of teak, more easily repaired than metal and less likely to cause severe splinter wounds to crewmen. Unlike the Japanese carriers, the Yorktowns were all equipped with radar, which could detect aircraft flying up to 30,000 feet and at a range of over 100 miles. While the Lexington would not participate in the Battle of Midway, it would assume a crucial role in the earlier engagement, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Lexington had been laid down as a battlecruiser in 1921 and converted during construction. She emerged as America's first fleet carrier and one of the largest aircraft carriers in the world. Because Lexington was a very early design, her available deck and hangar space was not efficiently used, and her aircraft complement was a modest 63. Originally conceived as a biplane carrier fighter, the Grumman Wildcat was redesigned as a mid-wing monoplane during the planning stages. The aircraft entered U.S. Navy service in 1939 and was manufactured first by Grumman and later by General Motors. Powered by a Wright Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine, the Wildcat was slower than its opposite number, the Zero. Nonetheless, its exceptional maneuverability, formidable 6-gun armament, effective armor, and robust construction meant that the Wildcats could frequently endure battle damage that would be catastrophic for any other fighter. Nearly 8,000 Wildcats would see service in World War II. From its introduction in June 1940, the Douglas Dauntless was one of the most important American combat aircraft of the war. In the first half of 1942, the Dauntless saw more action than any other type. The Dauntless was a dive bomber with heavy armor, a bulletproof windscreen, and self-sealing fuel tanks. It was powered by a 9-cylinder Wright Cyclone radial engine. Because of its great stability in flight, the aircraft was known affectionately to its pilots as the Barge. When it first entered service with the U.S. Navy, the Dauntless was the best carrier-based dive bomber in the world. The aircraft would take credit for sinking more Japanese shipping than any other Allied weapon, and during the Battle of Midway, it would be responsible for all Japanese ship losses. The 3-man Douglas Devastator, America's first carrier monoplane, had entered service in 1937, and by 1942 was already obsolete. It was slow, lightly armed, and had a poor rate of climb. At Midway, Devastators would suffer appalling losses, and the battle would be the aircraft's last major action of the war. The Grumman TBF was initially conceived as a replacement for the Devastator, and despite its rapid design process, it would ultimately establish itself as the most successful torpedo bomber of World War II. The TBF was a robust and powerful 3-seater aircraft. It was the first American naval warplane to mount a power-operated turret, and the only to carry its torpedo internally. The TBF entered service in early 1942, but only 6 were available for the Battle of Midway. All were stationed on Midway Island. It would be the TBF's first combat action, and in the memory of the men lost during the battle, the aircraft would afterwards be renamed the Avenger. The consolidated PBY Catalina would become one of the most successful flying boats of World War II, and the most numerous flying boat ever. The Catalina was unique as the first flying boat to feature cantilever wings which needed no supporting spars. It also had established floats, which could be retracted to form the wingtips in flight. The resulting aerodynamic efficiency made for speed and long range. After the first 4 marks of the PBY flying boat, the aircraft was fitted with retractable tricycle landing gear to give it an amphibious capability. While capable of carrying a substantial bomb load, it was the long-range reconnaissance capability of the Catalina that proved to be invaluable to the Americans during the Battle of Midway. Catalinas would also save the lives of many ditched American flyers. The B-17, a 4-engine heavy bomber, had first entered service with the United States Army in June 1939. Despite the aircraft's later fame as a strategic bomber, its original specification was actually for a long-range anti-shipping weapon, a role it would indeed fulfill during the Battle of Midway, driven by political considerations. The B-17E fully lived up to its designation as a flying fortress, intended to operate in self-defending formations. The B-17E mounted 2 hydraulically operated turrets, one of them a retractable ball underneath the aircraft. Altogether, the fortress carried 11 machine guns and was fitted with self-sealing fuel tanks and extensive armor. Despite its size and power, the B-17 had a low wing loading, making it more likely to return its crew home even when sustaining heavy combat damage compared to other aircraft of its class. In the Battle of Midway, 19 B-17s of the U.S. Army Air Force would operate against the Japanese. To extend their range, they would carry extra fuel tanks and half their normal bomb load. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had united the American people at a single stroke. Military and civilians alike shared a bitter resolve to see the Japanese totally defeated. Across the country, hundreds of thousands flocked to the recruitment centers. The impact of the Japanese attack had been particularly deep felt by the personnel of the United States Navy, and this humiliation had infused even the most routine training exercises with extraordinary level of intensity. Unlike the Japanese, whose trainee naval pilots were an elite selected at 14 years of age, the Americans recruited from a much wider segment of the population. In the United States, there were far more suitably educated recruits with the right mental and physical qualities for a carrier pilot. On America's entry into the war, the training schools were easily expanded without any appreciable fall-off in quality. After 3 months of elementary flying instruction, the aspiring naval pilots spent another 3 months in basic Navy training. Periods at 2 more flight schools were followed, and only the best were selected for training as carrier pilots. Despite the high quality of U.S. Navy flight training, American carrier pilots would enter combat with significantly less flight experience, having amassed just over half the 700 hours of flying time achieved by their Japanese counterparts. They had also, as yet, seen little combat. Some of them had participated in raids on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, primarily organized for training and morale-boosting purposes rather than significant strategic objectives. These actions, however, were relatively minor and encountered minimal serious opposition. As for the flight deck crew, American performance was at least as effective as the Japanese. The men were just as capable of launching a wave of strike aircraft within 5 minutes. Where the Americans did have a real edge on the enemy was in damage control. Damage control parties were highly trained in their duties, and their ability to deal with fire, the greatest threat to any warship, was unsurpassed. During the Battle of Midway, the comparative damage control abilities of each side would emerge as a crucial determinant in shaping the battle's outcome. By late April 1942, preparations for the Japanese campaign were well underway. Naval facilities at the port of Rabaul had been greatly expanded, and thousands of troops had been assembled ready for the conquest of New Guinea and Tulagi. The troops' transports were ready to sail, along with the escorts of cruisers and destroyers. The Japanese anticipated little opposition on Tulagi, and once the island had been captured, the Port Moresby assault would follow. In both cases, the Japanese expected that surprise would be on their side. As the 3 Japanese aircraft carriers, which had gathered for their mission, readied themselves to carry out their jobs, one to escort the Port Moresby invasion force, and the other 2 to assume positions in the Coral Sea, the Americans acted decisively. A task force based around the carriers Yorktown and Lexington was sent racing to intercept the Japanese. On May the 1st, south of the Solomon Islands, the carriers rendezvoused with a powerful force of Australian cruisers. The stage was now set for the Battle of the Coral Sea, marking the initial engagement in an epic confrontation that would ultimately alter the course of the Pacific War. The capture of the island of Tulagi on May the 3rd, 1942 was, as the Japanese expected, simply a matter of dropping anchor and disembarking the troops. Tulagi's tiny garrison of Australians had already been evacuated, The first blow in Japan's great campaign of expansion had apparently gone strictly to plan. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, the American carrier Yorktown, with Admiral Fletcher aboard, had received intelligence regarding the deployments in Tulagi and was already underway, heading north. At 7 a.m. on the morning after the Tulagi landings, Yorktown struck. 40 of Fletcher's aircraft were launched against the Japanese fleet and the occupation force. In little over an hour, the American bombers and torpedo bombers had sunk or damaged the destroyer, 3 minesweepers, a number of landing craft, and several seaplanes. For the Japanese, it was the first unsettling evidence that American carriers lurked in the area. On already the second day of operations, events were already taking an ominous turn. By the following day, Yorktown and her escorts had already to rendezvous with Lexington. The 2 escort groups now merged to form a single screen around the carriers. They had joined forces only just in time. The Japanese carriers Chokaku and Zuikaku had entered the Coral Sea, and the 2 fleets were now just 70 miles apart. On the morning of May the 7th, the American carrier task force with Lexington and Yorktown was cruising on a northwesterly course. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were sailing on parallel course. Each fleet was unaware of the other's presence. American scout planes sent to the northeast failed to find the Japanese carriers, but as soon as they heard, the Americans launched a strike force of 93 aircraft. In fact, the ships sided with the cruisers and destroyers of the New Guinea invasion force, but soon after, the Shoho was spotted only 25 miles away, and the attack was redirected. Shoho was hit by 13 bombs and 7 torpedoes. She sank within minutes. For the Imperial Navy, the loss of Shoho was deeply traumatic. So shocked were the Japanese commanders that the invasion of Port Moresby was immediately cancelled and the troop ships returned back to Rabaul. On the American side, there was jubilation. A pilot's radio report of the Shoho sinking, Scratch 1 flat top, would become one of the most famous signals of the Pacific War. After the sinking of the Shoho, Admiral Fletcher did not immediately launch another strike against the Japanese invasion fleet. To attack the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku was his main objective, and in any case, the Japanese might themselves attack, and he would need his air defense at full strength. As the day advanced, a weather front closed in on the Japanese carriers. Nevertheless, the strike force commander, Admiral Tagaki, was determined to destroy the Americans before they could inflict yet more damage on the retreating Japanese invasion fleet. Choosing his best night flyers, Tagaki launched his attack in the late afternoon. The aircraft would have to return and land in darkness. The Japanese raiders, in spite of the poor weather, passed close to the American carrier group. The Americans, with the benefit of radar, easily detected the enemy formations and vectored their fighters to intercept. In a series of vicious dogfights, 10 Japanese aircraft were shot down. 11 more would crash after the mission, trying to land in darkness. For the Japanese, the raid was a fiasco. In the aftermath of this first carrier clash between the Imperial Navy and the U.S. Pacific Fleet, both sides considered attacking by night with their cruisers and destroyers. Both finally rejected the idea, fearing the absence of their protective screens. Instead, they withdrew, postponing the main action for another day. On the morning of May the 8th, the American and Japanese fleets were more than 100 miles apart. The Japanese had the benefit of low cloud cover, while the Americans were exposed under the clear blue skies. At 0600, both sides launched their reconnaissance aircraft, and within 2 hours, each fleet had discovered the other. On the American side, Yorktown and Lexington launched 70 bombers and torpedo bombers and 6 fighters. At almost the same time, Shokaku and Zuikaku launched 50 attack aircraft and 20 fighters. Although the Japanese carriers were close together, Zuikaku was hidden by a cloud, and it was Shokaku who fell victim to the Americans. She was hit by 3 bombs and so badly damaged that she would later be unable to recover her aircraft. Most would be forced to ditch into the sea. The American carriers, using their radar, detected the approaching Japanese raiders 70 miles away. 12 Wildcat fighters were scrambled, but only 3 reached a high enough altitude to attack, and no Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Yorktown was first to be hit. A single bomb found its target. The next victim was the larger and less maneuverable Lexington. 2 bombs struck her deck, inflicting minor damage. But far more seriously, 2 torpedoes impacted her port side. Even after the Japanese bombs and torpedoes had struck, Lexington continued to fight. But soon after the battle, she began to list to port. By pumping oil from one side of the carrier to the other, the crew managed to right the vessel, and she was soon capable of maintaining 24 knots. It looked as if Lexington might be able to reach home under her own steam. However, at 14:45, an explosion ripped through the carrier, and soon fires were raging out of control. The order was given to abandon ship, and after her crew had been taken off, a destroyer was detailed to sink the hell-blazing hulk with torpedoes. 38 aircraft were still on board. The destruction of Lexington meant that the Battle of the Coral Sea was a tactical victory for the Japanese. The light carrier Shoho had been exchanged for the far more formidable Lexington. However, the Imperial Navy had been far more badly damaged than it seemed. The carrier Shokaku was out of action, and Zuikaku's aircrew had been slaughtered. As a result, neither carrier would be able to participate in the decisive battle soon to be fought at Midway. In the aftermath of the Coral Sea battle, the Japanese made a fatal error. They knew they had sunk the Lexington, but they also believed that Yorktown had been smashed beyond repair. Even with 2 of their own heavy carriers out of action and the loss of the Shoho, they were certain that the balance was still in their favor. The remaining Japanese carriers, supported by battleships and heavy cruisers, would still have more than enough firepower to send the American Pacific Fleet to the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese main force for the Battle of Midway was based in Hashirajima in Japan. The main force was commanded by Admiral Yamamoto himself. Yamamoto had 7 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 2 seaplane carriers, 1 light carrier, and 20 destroyers. Attached to the main force was Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carrier strike force, the most powerful carrier fleet at that time in the world. His heavy cruisers, Hiryu, Soryu, Akagi, and Kaga, would be escorted by 2 fast battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Midway invasion force was commanded by Admiral Nobukate Kondo. Its main body was made up of 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light carrier, and 7 destroyers. Subordinate to Admiral Kondo was the Midway occupation force commanded by Rear Admiral Reisa Tanaka. Tanaka had 12 transports with 5,000 troops and a screen of 1 light cruiser, 10 destroyers, and 3 patrol boats. At the Guams and the Marianas was the Midway support force under the command of Rear Admiral Taeko Kurita. Kurita had 4 heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers. As well as his Midway forces, Admiral Yamamoto had an overall command of the Aleutians fleet. Based in the anchorage of Ominato in the northern island of the Japanese homeland. The northern force was made up of a carrier striking force with 1 heavy and 1 light carrier, 2 cruisers, and 3 destroyers. There was also an invasion fleet of 4 transports carrying 1,000 soldiers, accompanied by a 7-strong destroyer screen. With the Lexington sunk and the Yorktown badly damaged in the Coral Sea, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been critically weakened. Yorktown went to the dry dock in Pearl Harbor with damage estimated to need at least 3 months to repair. In fact, the yards achieved near miraculous results. The job was done in 3 days, with 1,500 men working around the clock. How much minor damage had not yet been put right, and as the carrier sailed, scores of dockyard crew remained on board. Admiral Chester Nimitz, overall commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, would stay in Pearl Harbor throughout the Battle of Midway. Communicating with the ships by radio, Nimitz divided his carriers into two task forces. Task Force 17 was commanded by Admiral Frank Fletcher, veteran of the Coral Sea. Fletcher had Yorktown as his flagship, 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers. Fletcher also had operational command of Task Force 16, led by Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance had the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, along with 2 cruisers and 11 destroyers. From Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz deployed 19 submarines for reconnaissance and attack, which would patrol off Midway and Hawaii. He would also call on aircraft based on the island of Midway itself. The U.S. Army Air Force had 4 B-26s and 19 B-17E bombers. The Marines fielded 20 Buffalo and 7 Wildcat fighters. They also had 11 Vindicator and 16 Dauntless bombers. The Navy had 38 Catalinas and 6 TBF torpedo bombers. The island was also defended by the 6th Marine Defense Battalion of 3,000 men. On the morning of May the 27th, the Japanese carrier strike force under Admiral Nagumo sailed from Hashirajima. By nightfall, they had entered the Pacific and were heading for Midway. The following day, the Aleutians invasion force and the main body of warships sorted from Ominato. At the same time, far to the south, the Midway invasion force, with its escort of destroyers and invasion support force of heavy cruisers, sorted from the Marianas. Last to leave port, on the 29th, were the invasion force main body and Yamamoto's fleet, each of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Although Admiral Nimitz and his senior commanders knew that Midway was to be invaded, for security reasons, no one on the island was told that the mightiest concentration of naval power in history was bearing down upon them. Piecemeal, Midway's marine garrison was reinforced and the island's anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened. Every day, the Catalina flying boats patrol the ocean around the island in greater numbers. Although none of their crew knew yet precisely what they were searching for. The Japanese, too, had begun their reconnaissance effort. An advanced submarine force had been at sea for many days, racing towards Hawaii. Its task would be to set up a picket north of Pearl Harbor and report the strength of any American fleet dispatched to Midway. The submarines were in fact already too late. On May the 28th, Task Force 16 left Pearl Harbor unobserved, followed by Task Force 17 on the 30th. Both groups vanished into the Pacific Ocean, and the Japanese submarines, which would finally arrive on June 3rd, would watch in vain. By June the 2nd, the Japanese Northern Force was plowing its way through the Northern Pacific, towards the Aleutians. The island, although of immense strategic importance to the United States, were sparsely manned, the only forces of any consequence deployed at Dutch Harbor. The Americans, expecting the Japanese attack, flew repeated reconnaissance missions, but because of poor weather, failed to locate the enemy. The Japanese at first feared little better, but a second strike group did succeed in bombing Dutch Harbor. Over the following days, troops from the Special Naval Landing Force occupied Kiska and Attu. Although the Aleutians operation was in tactical terms a complete success, and the Japanese occupation of the islands would be a thorn in the American side for some time to come, the primary objective of the invasion had failed. The Americans, instead of dispatching strong naval forces north away from Midway, ignored the diversion. A key element in the Japanese plan failed completely. While the Japanese Northern Force was launching its attack on the Aleutians, hundreds of miles to the south, Nagumo's carrier strike force was fast approaching Midway. 200 miles behind Will Yamamoto's main force battleships and steaming from the southwest, the Midway invasion fleet. With no cloud cover, the invasion flotilla was desperately exposed, and by now, Midway's Catalinas were sweeping a huge arc of ocean, up to 700 miles, covering all the likely approaches to the island. It was on June 3rd, at 0900 hours, that a Catalina made the first sighting of Japanese ships off Midway. The pilot reported 2 cargo vessels. 21 minutes later, another Catalina, flown by Ensign Jack Reed, and just beyond the extreme limit of its allotted search, spotted a large formation of ships. The message dispatched to Midway read, "Sighted main body," and a few minutes later gave its bearing and range. Although the distance, 700 miles, was within the capabilities of Midway's B-17 bombers, which already had their extra fuel tanks fitted and were armed and waiting, Midway's commanders were unwilling to commit their forces without more information. It would be another 2 hours of steadily mounting tension before a radio message confirmed the sighting of a large body of Japanese warships. Meanwhile, reports of the sighting were passed on to the American carriers. The 2 American carrier task forces were waiting 325 miles to the northeast of Midway. The Catalina's report placed the Japanese main body to the southwest. However, Nimitz was confident of his intelligence sources and certain that the ships were only the Japanese invasion force. Nimitz signaled his commanders, "The carrier strike force will hit from the northwest, tomorrow." Fletcher ordered the Enterprise and Hornet to change course, and both task forces headed south to lie in wait. With the sighting of the Japanese invasion fleet confirmed, Midway's B-17s were finally given the order to attack. At 12:25 hours, 9 bombers lumbered down the island's runway to launch the first attack of the Battle of Midway. It would take over 4 hours for the B-17s to reach the enemy fleet and begin their high-level runs. Because of their extra fuel tanks, the fortresses were carrying only 36 500-pound bombs between them. None struck home. From altitude, the effects were hard to judge, and the crews reported hits on 6 vessels, including 2 battleships. In the aftermath, the U.S. Army Air Force would claim a major victory for land-based high-level bombers. Throughout the night of June the 3rd, the atmosphere on Midway was tense, but confident. The reports of B-17 crews were encouraging. Everyone believed that at least some damage had been done to the Japanese fleet. During the night, a Catalina torpedo attack on the invasion transports did succeed in hitting 1 Japanese oiler. Insignificant in real terms, but heartening for the waiting Marines. At first light, Midway's Catalinas were once more dispatched on their reconnaissance patrols. Because a Japanese raid on the airfield was almost certain, the B-17s were ordered to take off once more to prevent them from being caught on the ground. As the Japanese carrier strike force steamed at 24 knots on its final run into Midway, sailors and air crew prepared themselves for the ordeal ahead with traditional toasts and worship at the Shinto shrine on board every Japanese warship. All were keenly aware that they were about to strike the first major blow in a battle on which depended not only on their own lives, but the future of the Japanese Empire. At 0430 hours, Admiral Nagumo turned his carriers into the wind and launched his first strike wave, 108 aircraft in all. The rest, including his most experienced aircrew, were held in reserve in case any American warships were discovered. Nagumo believed the possibility extremely remote, so only after his first wave had been sent to Midway did he order the reconnaissance aircraft to begin their search on the surrounding ocean. The search, mounted by the Japanese carrier strike force, was conducted by only 7 aircraft from 5 ships. Akagi and Kaga each launched 1 VAL at 0430 hours. Both aircraft were to search 300 miles out and could cover an area 60 miles wide. At the same time, the battleship Haruna launched 1 float plane with a range of 150 miles. The cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, were each dispatched 2 float planes. But technical problems delayed Tone's aircraft for up to half an hour, and one of Chikuma's developed engine trouble and would have to turn back. The search was dangerously incomplete. As the Japanese scouted for American carriers, the Catalinas were in their turn looking for the Japanese. At 0530 hours, a single enemy carrier was sighted. On Midway Island and on the ships of the American task forces, the effect was electrifying. The Japanese were exactly where Admiral Nimitz had expected them to be. Shortly after the first sighting, one more vital piece of information was received from the Catalinas. A wave of strike aircraft was approaching the island. To Admiral Spruance on board the Enterprise, it was a priceless piece of information. Soon after the aircraft had hit Midway, the Japanese carriers would have to retrieve them for rearming and refueling. At that point, the carriers would be supremely vulnerable. As the Japanese strike wave came within range of Midway radar, all the island's remaining aircraft were scrambled. When the enemy arrived, the runways and hangars would be clear. Midway's fighters would be waiting to meet them, and the island's force of bombers and torpedo bombers would already be on their way to strike back at the Japanese carriers. In spite of the valiant efforts of Midway's mostly obsolete fighters, the Japanese bombers and dive bombers broke through without having lost a single aircraft. However, as soon as the lead attackers came within range of the island's anti-aircraft guns, they were met by a hail of fire. Finding no American planes on the ground, the bombers attacked and destroyed Midway's oil tanks on Sand Island. At the same time, the dive bombers targeted the airfield and hangars on Eastern Island and destroyed virtually every building in sight. With 15 of Midway's defending fighters already shot down, the Japanese fighters were now free to strafe ground targets. They too met a murderous hail of anti-aircraft fire. In all, 6 Japanese aircraft would fall to Midway's guns. When the Japanese headed back to their carriers at 0643, it was already apparent to the strike leader that although they left behind a trail of destruction, they had not succeeded in their primary objective. By radio, he reported that most of Midway's aircraft had escaped, and the island's runways remained largely intact. Midway's bombers were still a serious threat to the Japanese fleet. Even before the strike wave had returned to its carriers, Admiral Nagumo was ordering a second attack on the island. Only moments later, there was a dramatic confirmation of the threat Midway's aircraft posed to Nagumo's carriers. 6 American TBF torpedo bombers and 4 B-26 medium bombers suddenly bore down on the Japanese carrier fleet. The screening destroyers and cruisers put up a storm of anti-aircraft fire. At the same time, 10 Zero fighters of Akagi's Combat Air Patrol swooped in to attack. The TBFs did succeed in launching at Akagi, but violent maneuvering saved the Japanese carrier. Savaged by the Zeros and by furious anti-aircraft fire, only 1 TBF and 2 B-26s survived the raid. At almost the same time as the Japanese fleet was beating off the first wave of attackers from Midway, the American task forces were preparing to launch their own strike waves. Reconnaissance had now confirmed that there were not 1, but 2 enemy carriers in the area. Such a target was simply too good a chance to miss. The latest reconnaissance placed the 2 Japanese carriers over 200 miles from the Americans. The maximum range for an airstrike was around 150 miles, so the first priority was to close the gap. Assuming that Nagumo's carriers would still be steaming towards Midway, Fletcher set a course to intercept. Only Spurance's Task Force 16 with Enterprise and Hornet was to be sent. Task Force 17 with Yorktown would wait to recover her scout planes and follow later. If the Americans were to catch the Japanese as they rearmed aircraft returning from the attack on Midway, they would have to launch their first strike wave around 0700 hours. Although the range was closing quickly, it was still too great for the devastated torpedo bombers to strike and return home. They would be sent regardless. Those that survived the raid would have to ditch in the sea. Altogether, Hornet and Enterprise launched 29 Devastator torpedo bombers and 72 Dauntless dive bombers. For fighter, they were covered by 20 Wildcats. Admiral Spruance was aware that only 2 of at least 4 Japanese carriers had been located, and kept 36 fighters to defend his task force from any Japanese counterattack. As the strike groups from the Hornet and Enterprise set course for the enemy fleet, Yorktown, her scout planes now recovered, raced to catch up with Task Force 16. At 0838, Admiral Fletcher launched his strike aircraft. Within half an hour, the total number of American aircraft heading for the Japanese fleet had reached 156. Even now, the Japanese were still unaware that they had been found and targeted by enemy carriers. Nagumo's men were toiling to prepare their aircraft for the second raid on Midway, and the admiral was confident his fleet was secure. His scout planes had been out almost 2 hours and had reported no sign of an American task force. In fact, Japanese reconnaissance had been a disastrous failure. By now, Task Force 16, streaming towards Nagumo's fleet, was well inside the search area of the Japanese scout planes. However, Chikuma's float plane had flown right past the Americans and had failed to spot them, because Tone's scout could not search the same area until the return leg of its flight, and had been delayed by half an hour to begin with. The error was not detected for a considerable time. When it was 0725, the pilot's report mentioned only enemy surface ships. As a result, Nagumo now believed there was no immediate threat from the American carriers. At 0748, as the Japanese were just about to launch the second Midway strike, they themselves suddenly came under attack. It was another raid from Midway Island. First came 16 dauntless dive bombers, whose inexperienced pilots approached in a shallow glide. The Zeros of Nagumo's combat air patrol destroyed half their number before they even reached the carriers. Next came Midway's B-17s, dropping their bombs from 20,000 feet. Not a single Japanese vessel was hit. Midway's marine vindicators were equally unsuccessful. As the American raiders headed home and Nagumo once more turned into the wind to launch his second wave against Midway, dramatic news was reported by a scout plane. The pilot had spotted a carrier. For Nagumo, the revelation could not have come at a worse moment. While the Japanese second wave was preparing to launch, Nagumo's first wave just returned from Midway was cycling, waiting to land, also waiting to refuel and rearmed with the fleet's Zero fighters, which had been in action protecting the carriers. If Nagumo were to launch his second wave against the reported enemy carrier, they would have to go without fighter cover. Nagumo decided to wait. He would return his second wave below decks, recovering his circling aircraft for refueling, then launch a full-scale attack on the American fleet. At 0917, with all their aircraft recovered, the Japanese carriers, up to now heading towards Midway, turned east-northeast to close with the American force. Nagumo's strike force would be ready to launch at 10:30 hours. As the Japanese surged ahead at 30 knots, the decks of Nagumo's carriers were chaotic. Flight crews struggled frantically to refuel and rearm their aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes lay everywhere, and there was no time to follow safety procedures. And unknown to the Japanese, who had no radar, the first American torpedo bombers were only 3 minutes away. The American air group from Task Force 16 that followed a course based on the assumption that the Japanese fleet had carried on sailing towards Midway. Instead, Nagumo had changed course. As a result, most of the dive bombers and fighters from Hornet, 45 aircraft in all, failed to find the enemy. A second group of Hornet's aircraft had also at first missed Nagumo's fleet, but had then turned north and within minutes had found the Japanese carriers. The first target for Hornet's torpedo bombers was Akagi. As the squadron swept in at low level, the Zeros pounced. The few Americans that survived were torn apart by the fleet's anti-aircraft fire. Not one torpedo bomber and only one pilot survived. Within minutes of the first raid, torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown began their attack. Once again, the American pilots were slaughtered and no enemy ships were hit. Only 6 raiders survived. With the torpedo attacks beaten off and his fleet still fully unscathed, Nagumo was at last ready to send his waiting strike aircraft against the American carriers. Just as the launch signal was about to be given, American dive bombers, which had been lurking high in the clouds, pounced on the carriers. The first victim was Kaga. The time was around 10:20 hours. The first bomb to strike Kaga landed on the rear of her flight deck, squarely amongst aircraft armed and waiting to take off. 2 more hit near her forward elevator. Another exploded in the hangar below, igniting fuel and detonating bombs. Kaga was left a raging inferno within minutes, and almost everyone on her bridge was killed. As Kaga burned, Akagi was launching its first Zero fighter for the attack that was supposed to smash the American fleet. At that moment, 3 Dauntless dive bombers struck. The first hit on Akagi landed near her midships lift and exploded in the hangar. The next fell amongst the parked aircraft on her deck. Fuel and bombs ignited immediately, killing the elite of the Japanese air fleet in their cockpits. Within minutes, the fire had spread forward, and Admiral Nagumo's flagship was doomed. The next victim of the American dive bombers was Soryu. Just after 10:25, 3 bombs smashed into the carrier's flight deck. The first bomb fell between Soryu's second and third lifts. The next landed in front of the forward lift and penetrated to the hangar, detonating bombs, torpedoes, and fuel. The third struck on the rear deck, completely destroying a waiting strike wave. In the space of 5 minutes, the mightiest carrier fleet in existence had been shattered. Admiral Nagumo, his flagship blazing, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser. Of his once magnificent carrier force, only Hiryu was left, and immediately the order was given to launch her strike aircraft. There was still some hope, but even now, a devastating blow could be visited on the American enemy. The first wave of Hiryu's strike force was made up of 18 Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters. The target was Task Force 17 and the carrier Yorktown. Shortly before noon, the Vals were detected by Yorktown's radar. Already, 12 Wildcat fighters were in the air covering the carrier, and another 15 were on the deck refueling. These were ordered to launch at once. At the same time, Yorktown's aviation gas lines were shut down and her fire suppression system was activated. The Japanese strike wave, approaching at 10,000 feet, ran straight into Yorktown's fighter defenses. 10 were shot down by the Wildcats. The 14 survivors headed straight for the American carrier. 5 Vals survived the gauntlet of Wildcats and the hail of fire put up by Yorktown and her escorts. 3 bombs plunged into Fletcher's flagship. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck and exploded. The second penetrated and burst below the funnel, damaging all but one of the ship's boilers and destroying her radar room. The third bomb crashed through Yorktown's number 1 elevator and deep into her hangar. In spite of being hit by 3 bombs, so good was Yorktown's damage control that potentially catastrophic fires were quickly put out. No fuel or magazines exploded, and amazingly, Yorktown was streaming at 20 knots and able to recover and relaunch her fighters within 1 hour and 40 minutes of the attack. By now, the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu had launched her second wave. A scratch force of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. Once again, American Wildcats savaged the raiders, but 9 torpedo bombers survived and swept into the attack. Because Yorktown was no longer belching smoke, she was mistaken for one of the unscathed sister ships. Although 5 more Kates were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, 4 launched their torpedoes. Yorktown was hit twice on the port side, and one of the raiders deliberately crashed onto her deck. Within seconds of the strike, Yorktown was racked by explosions and began to list to port. At 1500 hours, the order was given to abandon ship. As the first of Yorktown's crew were being taken off by her attendant destroyers, aboard Enterprise, Admiral Spruance received news from a scout aircraft that Hiryu had been spotted. The Japanese carrier was 100 miles northwest of the dying Yorktown. At 1530 hours, Enterprise launched 24 Dauntless dive bombers and Hornet another 16. Meanwhile, Hiryu was recovering and refueling her last remaining aircraft for a third strike against the American carriers. At 17:05, the Dauntless, undetected by Hiryu's combat air patrol, screamed down out of the sun. Hiryu maneuvered violently, but 4 bombs found their target. The first 2 bombs to hit blew Hiryu's number 1 lift clean off, and left the whole forward deck a massive flame. The other 2 penetrated to the hangar, where bombs and fuel exploded violently. The waiting aircraft at the rear of the flight deck blew up, killing almost all their pilots. Admiral Nagumo's last carrier was finished, and with her, Japanese domination of the skies over the Pacific. When Admiral Yamamoto learned of the catastrophe that had befallen his fleet, he did not at once abandon all hope. Perhaps with the awesome firepower of his battleships and cruisers, he could yet destroy the Americans in a night battle. Yamamoto was clutching at straws. That evening, American carriers sailed eastward, and Yamamoto could no longer force a battle before daylight exposed his ships to air attack. At 02:55, on the morning of June the 5th, Admiral Yamamoto ordered a general withdrawal. On the morning of June the 6th, strike waves from the Enterprise and Hornet added to the American tally of 4 Japanese carriers by sinking 1 cruiser and damaging another. With them, the number of Japanese dead rose to 3,500 men. On the American side, the cost of victory was the carrier Yorktown, finally sunk by torpedoes from a prowling Japanese submarine, and the destroyer Hammond that had been lying alongside. In all, 307 aircrew, sailors, and Marines had died. For the United States, the Battle of Midway would prove the turning point in the fight against Japan. Unable to replace her losses in carriers and aircrew, the Japanese Empire would never again be capable of taking the initiative. Japan had not only suffered the greatest defeat in her history, but had, in a single day, lost the Pacific War.